Hello and welcome to Face to Face. Today we're going to be talking about something that I think is very important, 9/11. It's almost 10 years ago now that it happened, but it is still intruding into our lives in the most important ways. We are filming this very early in February, virtually on the eve of the day that Stephen Harper is going down to Washington to sign a new border agreement that is the next step in the corporate takeover of Canada and of the United States. And that deal is all predicated on the terror problems that we face because of 9/11. We're talking today with Werner Simbeck. Werner is a mechanical engineer. He's been involved in looking into 9/11 for a long time. Werner, where should we start? It's such a big topic.
It is a big topic. Let's talk about what most people don't know. Most people don't know that on September 11, 2001, that 3 high-rise buildings collapsed in New York, not just 2. A lot of people don't know that. Everyone's seen the horrific pictures of those planes hitting those towers, and then about an hour later they collapsed, one and then the other. But what most people don't know is that a 3rd tower collapsed, and it wasn't just an insignificant tower. It was 47 stories worth of a high-rise building that was sort of adjacent to the Twin Towers. It's called WTC 7. So the World Trade Center complex had 7 buildings. There was Tower 1 and Tower 2, that's WTC 1 and 2. And there were other buildings below the towers. And there was also Building 7. That collapsed that afternoon at around 5:20 on that tragic day. It's funny that it may have been mentioned, you may have heard it at the time, but then it was really quiet about that building. It wasn't really mentioned again. When the families that lost loved ones during that tragic event on September 11, when they demanded an independent investigation into the events of what caused it, where the failures were in the military or into the intelligence gathering and what have you, Bush reluctantly called on to or brought in a commission to investigate into the events of September 11. And then there was a commission report that came out about 9 months thereafter. And there wasn't a single word mentioning that Building 7, which was the 3rd biggest structural failure in history. There has never been a moment in time prior to 9/11 where a structural steel building of any size came down, crashing down due to office fire. That just has never happened. And after 9/11, there were great examples in the world where office towers caught on fire, particularly in China. There was most recently one in Beijing, a building that caught on fire that was equivalent in size as the Building 7, for example, that was lit up like a Christmas tree. I mean, it was on blaze. It was on fire for about 6 hours or so. And it was a steel frame building, and it still stood. And they're just refurbishing it and putting it all back together. It did not collapse.
Now, you're a mechanical engineer. People are going to say, well, these 2 buildings were hit by airplanes. So that adds another element to the day.
Yeah.
Are the airplanes... Now, both of us, both Werner and I, are saying we need an independent investigation into 9/11. Even today, we need one, because the events of that day cannot continue to go unquestioned as they have been.
Yeah.
But could the airplanes have had anything to do with the bringing down of the buildings?
I think they certainly could contribute to damage of the buildings, to the structure. There may have been small sections of the buildings that could collapse. I'm not doubting that at all. But the complete dismemberment of the entire structure down to the basement at virtually free fall speed. That means if you were to drop a bowling ball off the top of the roof and you were to count how long it would take until it hits the ground, it took about that time to collapse. It was around 11 to 12 and a half seconds for the towers, and it was 6.75 seconds for Building 7. And actually NIST, who was charged with investigating the collapse of Building 7, they actually had to admit that it was falling for the first 100 feet or so at free fall speed. That means right at the start of the collapse of that building. So people who haven't seen that collapse, probably because they never saw it on TV because it was really not shown. There's some really excellent footage on the internet, so all you have to do is go to Google and go type in WTC 7 building collapse or World Trade Center 7 and watch that. When you see the footage, when you see how that building collapses, it's so unlike the towers. So that's the start. It's very different. And when you see it, you're like, well, I've seen that before. And most people have seen that before, because when you see a big casino or a big hotel in Las Vegas, for example, being demolished, it looks exactly like that.
So what you're thinking, and what I also believe, and what over 1,000 architects and engineers have signed their names to, is the belief that these buildings were brought down by controlled demolitions.
Yeah.
And if that's the case, then
everything changes. Yeah. Suddenly then the story changes. It's no longer just a few hijackers with bandanas and box cutters who can do this. You know, we have 2 planes and 3 high-rise buildings that collapse. Funny enough, the buildings that are below the towers that I mentioned earlier, so there were 7 buildings in total, 3 of them we already talked about. So there's WTC 3, 4, 5, and 6 that were below the towers. They still stood. They were heavily damaged because of the debris that was raining on them, these gigantic girders and beams, but they still stood. They did not collapse, and they were on fire as well. So the fact that a steel frame building can collapse into its own footprint in case of Building 7 because of office fires, that's not possible. That's you need to take out, in order for it to fall at free fall speed, even just for the first 100 feet, and then it was slightly decelerating. In order to do that, you have to remove all the columns at a fraction of a second at the same time. So a building of that size, you know, it's like a football field in area. That's a lot of columns to remove. In order for it to fall and to kink, like the way if you were to watch the footage, it kinks in. First you see actually the penthouse disappear, and then for about a second or 2 seconds nothing happens. And then the inside of the building kinks in, and then it just comes straight down. And it falls at free fall speed for the first 100 feet at what NIST had to admit, because a science teacher actually, he did a close analysis of it, and he had to ask a serious question about this, because it was obvious due to some really careful analysis, frame by frame, you could sort of mark the roof line that it was falling at gravity, meaning free fall, meaning there's no resistance whatsoever.
And if there's no resistance, what does that mean?
That means somehow these columns had to be removed. And the only way that we know columns can be removed in a building like this is with explosives. That's the only way you can do that. Otherwise, these buildings are made from sticks and paper, and you can't walk in them because they're so light, and a puff of air will blow them over. Like, it's not like that. They're designed. I mean, that's something that maybe I'd like to get into a bit. When engineers and architects design structures like this, they design them with redundancy in place, so they're overbuilt. They're much stronger than they need to be to carry the load, to carry the weight. So typically structures like this have a safety factor of 3 to 5, meaning it can carry 3 to 5 times its actual load requirement. Right? Railway bridges often have safety factors of 10, meaning it could carry 10 times as much load. Now, in case of these buildings, so you have a safety factor of 3, meaning even if they were weakened due to fire, you still have that safety buffer built into the structure, so that there is no way it can collapse. It's just not done like that. The only way it does happen is if you well-placed explosives that would then are triggered at the right moment in time that allows you to bring these down. And I guess the other interesting thing is that we have 3 high-rise buildings that collapsed on one day in New York, 2 hit by planes, 1 with office fire, and they both land in their own footprint.
All 3 land in their own
All
footprint.
3.
Yes.
Now,
And now what does that mean? They land
what does
in their
that
own
mean?
footprint?
So we like when you watch Knowledge Network or and you see a demolition team setting up a building, an old sports arena or an old high-rise. There's quite a few shows now that show you how they do this. It takes months of planning. It takes experts, modeling, make sure you know exactly where to place the explosives the right way, that it's wired up and sequenced just right so that it doesn't fall over, because typically structures like this are in urban areas where there's other structures that you don't want to damage. You don't want to have a 30 or 40 story building tilt over and hit neighboring buildings, because that would be very expensive, you know, the liability and the damage and all that. And of course, it's designed, demolitions are designed and well planned such that the damage is minimum. It falls into its own footprint. That way the debris field is small. It's you can easily get at it and start to remove it right away as soon as the demolition is complete.
So again, you're saying that this has to be done then by controlled demolition.
Yeah, there's no other way. If it was that easy, meaning if when we see this, that it takes months of planning and careful placement of charges. If the buildings were that simple to bring down with just simple office fires, why hire a group of demolition experts? I mean, there's an interesting clip on the internet that one can watch. It's a Dutch demolition expert is being asked by Dutch television, or I believe, about the World Trade Center collapses. So he gets to watch the footage again of the towers, and he believes that it is structural failure. He's actually convinced, he has convinced himself that that's what he's seeing. But then he's been shown, so he can live with that explanation, saying, well, there's a lot of weight and a lot of momentum.
And this is so he believes the official story.
That portion of the official story he believes, and I think a lot of other professionals would believe that as well. I did as well, by the way, right? I didn't just wake up one day and go, no. I mean, I saw this and I could see that structural failure could occur. But of course, what you're not being told is that there were lots of eyewitness reports of firefighters in and around the buildings, the ones that survived, that heard explosions going off, that there were explosions prior to the plane hitting the towers, et cetera, et cetera. So there was like the main lobbies of both Twin Towers was completely destroyed when the firefighters showed up just right after the planes hit, and there was no explanation of why it would be obviously damaged and the windows were blown out. What would have caused that? A plane hitting at the 80th floor would not allow you to knock out windows at the ground floor level. I mean, that just doesn't happen like that. And remove huge marble tiles off the inside lobby area. Anyway, so that's a different sort of aspect of that. But what I was going to say is that...
so this Dutch expert was...
This Dutch expert watches these 2 Twin Towers collapse, and he has some explanation. He can sort of rationalize why that occurred. And then he's being shown, but not explained, Building 7, how it collapses. Or basically just the footage of it collapsing. And he sees that, and he goes, well, that was a controlled demolition. That experts did that. I'm just quoting him. So he sees the characteristics, what he recognizes, and that even ordinary people recognize when they have watched these things in the past of buildings being demolished. And there's lots of examples on the internet. You can just Google controlled demolition. You can watch lots of these buildings being demolished. So there's these characteristics that you see that he recognizes being the expert. And then he's being told that that building was WT7, right next to the Twin Towers, that it collapsed that day, that afternoon. And he's questioning that. He's like, really? No, that can't be. So he was extremely shocked because he hadn't heard that before. And then once he was told that in fact this is what it was, that it actually did occur that afternoon, and then there were office fires in there, and that all the people were pulled out of the buildings, how is it possible that you could wire something like that up in that short period of time. So you'd have like from 10 o'clock that morning to about 4 o'clock or 5 o'clock before you have to pull out your demolition team. Could you do it in that period of time? Could you set up explosives that quickly? And he thought in theory it was possible, but very difficult if there were already office fires in the building. So, and the office fires are small, by the way. Like the pictures that you can see of the office fires that were, so because of the towers as they fell down, for some reason there was some ignition of debris that occurred in the building 7, which is, there's also claim that it was damaged, which I believe, sure, certain things can be damaged because of falling debris, but not to the extent where it would be engulfed in flames. It wasn't like that at all, ever. There was a few isolated pockets of fire, but that was
about it. So you mean
it.
This expert thought a building could actually be wired within the space of one day if you were ready to go?
If you were ready to go. Yeah, that was interesting. But he said you need a really good crew, that's what he thought. So, but then once he was told all these problems with it, meaning that there was office fires in place, and he still, though he was under the impression that, because he rationalized it in his mind, saying that they must have done it that day, so there must have been there must have been some foreknowledge. So the only way that he made sense of it, which was interesting, and I'm not saying he's right or wrong, but the way he made sense of it is that obviously there must have been some foreknowledge, meaning they knew the attacks were coming, but they didn't really, there was some advantage of letting it occur. So in the process of let's just get this building out of the way as well.
So here we are. I mean, here, Werner is a mechanical engineer. There are well over 1,000 engineers and architects in the United States who have signed a petition saying they do not believe the official story and they want an independent investigation. Our Prime Minister, this is being filmed very early in February, our Prime Minister is going to Washington tomorrow to sign a border agreement that is not good for Canadian sovereignty. And again, that's presupposed because of the terror threat we face because of 9/11. That's why that deal is being, and once again, the long arm of corporate America is just reaching out to take us over. This is just the next step. We need an independent investigation of 9/11. We're fighting a war in Afghanistan because of 9/11. The world has changed because of 9/11, but the official story really cannot be true. There are simply too many holes in it. Which brings us maybe to the question of the media. The media doesn't seem to want to report these discrepancies. And the fact, for example, the architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth, which I'm a signer and a member, so we have this petition with over 1,400 architects and engineers, licensed architects and engineers, who demand from Congress an independent and new investigation into these events. But we've tried to connect with CBC, for example, to let them know this was happening, that we were having a press conference actually here in Victoria, reading the same statement that was read in Washington, D.C. actually just recently, but there was no interest, none. So, if over 1,400 professionals basically put their career on the line, so to speak, because they feel that the evidence is so strong that the official story just does not hold up to scrutiny. And then there's more to this evidence that has been collected, and then we maybe get to that a little bit later, that it just doesn't hold up to the official story. The official story just doesn't match the facts, and there's so many holes, and there was never a proper forensic investigation done in the first place. For example, the NIST investigation, and there was a NIST report. You should just mention who NIST is. NIST is National Institute of Standards and Technology, I believe that's the acronym. They were charged, they were given, I think, $9 million at the time to investigate, for example, the collapse of the Twin Towers and then later the collapse of Building 7 to find out what was the cause of this collapse. Because we never had that, as I said earlier, we never had in history before a steel frame building collapsed due to office fire, as is the official explanation. When then asked NIST for the modeling information that they used to come up with their report and their analysis by the architects and engineers, they refused to hand over the model. They created a computer model to determine what was the initiation, the cause of the collapse. But they only ever take it to the point of initiation of collapse, not to then propagating that all the way through to the complete collapse. They only take it to the point when it starts.
and then says, well, there you go, it started, so we can now be all happy. We were able to show that if one of these columns fails, I forget which number it is, there's a particular column that had identified. A column was weakened due to fire and some of the damage coming from Twin Towers. That, as a result, caused that one column to fail, and that caused a ripple effect, like a domino effect, for the entire building to collapse. So they only take it up to that one point, and then they just say, well, we're done. So that's great, we've shown that now.
But the architects and engineers say that makes no sense.
No, it makes no sense whatsoever. Because if you just take one structural member out of the structure, that by itself does not lead you to total collapse.
And it's worth mentioning that these buildings had massive steel beams in them.
And columns.
Going top to bottom.
Yeah.
All of which disappeared. I mean, where were they at the end of the collapse? What happened to all of that steel? It was cut into nice small pieces, ready to be hauled away.
Ready to be loaded. Yeah.
And so a lot of people are saying, now, I mean, we're talking about Nobel Prize winners, physicists, professors, all of whom say the official story makes no sense. The official story cannot be true. The media will not report that.
Yeah. And I find that is the most disturbing thing of all, because if the citizenry is not well informed and not told either facts or problems with other facts or problems with stories, or in this case it's a conspiracy story that we're being told. A group of Arabs, terrorists, conspired to hurt the United States by flying commercial jetliners into buildings and causing casualties of enormous proportions. That's the official line. But the fact is that the military was standing down. The military did not send up any fighter jets in time. The fact is that they changed standard operating procedure for the military when engaging hijacked airplanes. That was conveniently changed just prior to September 11, meaning the head of the Pentagon had to be informed, and he had to give the authorization of engagement. And then that was Mr. Rumsfeld.
No, that's worth going into as well, because it was prior to that if there was even a hint that a plane was in danger or had been hijacked, the U.S. Air Force, the biggest in the world, would immediately launch fighters to go at that plane and make sure that they were there.
That's right.
But prior to 9/11, the rules and regulations were changed.
That's right.
And suddenly, it had to go through the bureaucracy before anything could happen, which meant that nothing did happen.
That's right. Mr. Rumsfeld was nowhere to be found.
That's right. They couldn't find
because he was helping the injured in the Pentagon.
The Secretary of Defense.
One of the most important people when a situation like this would occur. He was busy helping injured, which is very honorable, but very odd. There's another thing that I hadn't mentioned. So, forensic analysis hadn't been done, as I said, officially, but independent forensic analysis was most recently completed by a group of scientists throughout the world. They worked together. It was led by a scientist from Copenhagen, Niels Harrit. They analyzed the dust from the World Trade Center collapse. So they were able to get some dust samples from different locations. And they analyzed the dust to see what's in it. And it turns out that there are things in the dust that shouldn't be there. And I'm not a chemist, I'm not going to go into those particular details, but it turns out that they have found an incendiary called thermite. So the chemical footprint of thermite was found, and then they also found physical thermite. And thermite is a mixture of aluminum and iron oxide. If you mix aluminum and iron oxide at the right proportions together and you ignite it, it will burn violently. And if it's connected to steel, it will melt the steel.
So if we're talking about controlled demolition, we now have the way it was done, because thermite was found in the dust.
And then, of course, it's not just ordinary thermite, which is sort of the interesting thing, actually, on this. Because when you look at it under a powerful microscope, you can see the structure of these little particles that make up the thermite, this unexploded thermite that was found. And it's actually called nanothermite. And the reason why they say it's nanothermite, because the particles that make up the aluminum as well as the iron side are made up of tiny little microscopic spheres, and they're nano-sized particles. And to put this in perspective, in order to arrive at a nano-sized aluminum or iron oxide particle, you don't just grind aluminum or iron with a sandpaper, really fine sandpaper. You have to start at the molecular level. So you start at the atom level, and you build up atom by atom by atom to get to a nano-sized particle. So it's a man-made process, highly sophisticated. It's something you can't just, brew together in your basement. Only the most sophisticated military labs would be able to do something like this. And that's really suspect, right? So, and actually a group of citizens across Canada have sponsored Dr. Niels Harrit to come to Victoria, among other things. He's coming across Canada.
And what's he going to speak about?
He's going to speak about the chemical analysis that was done of the World Trade Center dust, what was found, and what that would mean. Because there are things in there that shouldn't be there. And the things that were found, obviously, he calls it's not the smoking gun, it's the loaded gun. Because the way he sees it, that's like the last nail in the coffin, because there has been all this other evidence, as I explained earlier, of initiation of free fall, collapse, eyewitness reports of explosions. And now we have chemical evidence that basically shows that it was brought down by explosives, high-tech explosives. So Dr. Niels Harrit is coming, it's February 26th, it's a Saturday. It'll be at the David Lamb Auditorium at the university, and there'll be tickets available at various bookstores.
Okay. How can people find some information on some of the things you've talked about? For example, the architects and engineers.
If you were to go on the internet, you have to have access to the internet because you just cannot get the information through the mainstream. So if you go to Google and type in ae911truth.org. ae911truth.org. Or you write it out, say architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth, you'll find it as well. And from that website, I think that's probably one of the better websites to start from. Because it's done by professionals. So, they go into the facts, they don't have any sort of conspiracy theories they attach to the facts. They just say the facts don't match the official story and we really need a new independent investigation.
So we have to ask, where are our federal politicians? Where is our media? The corporations are now planning to put a single border around Canada and the United States because of 9/11. We are the prize. Canada is a resource-rich nation, and they're reaching out to take us. False flag operations where things are done and then blamed on someone else are not new in history. Just Google false flag operations. They exist probably from the time of the Romans and the Greeks. I believe 9/11 was a false flag operation. Elements within the U.S. government had to be involved. The corporate media must have been involved and promised not to ask any questions, because if the questions were asked, obviously this would all come tumbling down. Werner, any last words?
I just hope that people, don't necessarily believe what I'm saying. They should take a little bit of time to use some common sense, some rational thinking, and do a bit of research. And don't believe everything you hear in the mainstream media, because it has spin on it, unfortunately.
You've been watching Face to Face. This has been a very important topic. We need to move ahead with it. Thank you very much for watching.